The topic this evening is covering basically some less common fruits that we can be growing in our area. Two of the three we'll discuss tonight are actually native fruits for us. One of them is not. And so let's go ahead and get started. Just let me remind you as we go through this evening that when I'm making reference to any commercial products, brand names, or suppliers, it's not intended to be an endorsement by myself nor the university. And also, I want to remind you if we're talking about any sort of pesticide usage, anytime we're utilizing pesticides, the label is the law. Those instructions are what must be followed. Nothing I say tonight would ever trump that label direction. So, what we'll be covering tonight are figs, elderberries, and pawpaws. We're not going to go super in depth on each one of these, but I think we'll go into enough depth that if you've ever wondered about growing these, that you'll at least know maybe I should dig a little more or not. In the resources I send you, you will have links for further reading. So don't feel like we're going to leave you hanging on that additional information. But basically, I want to do a general overview, talk about some major planting considerations. One thing I think when we're talking about fruit, what sort of pruning requirements does it have? What does it require of me as ongoing maintenance? I thought that was a good thing to mention on these. So we'll be covering this this evening, and hopefully you'll find it useful. One thing I will mention, generally speaking, about these three fruits, one, there's not a tremendous number of pest issues. That's not to say none, and I'll mention a few. But being that these are uncommon fruit crops, there are limited pesticide products that are available for use on them. So whenever we're talking about pesticides and crops, it doesn't matter whether it's ornamental or edible, to use a particular pesticide on that plant, one, the label has to specify that plant or crop is on there. And two, it has to even have the target pest we are wanting to control on there. So there's kind of like a two-party thing where both must be present on the label. So just because something may control Japanese beetles doesn't mean we're able to use it everywhere across our landscape, for instance. There may be some products that are only for turf applications or some that are only for ornamentals, while others are allowed for fruit. So because these are uncommon, you may find, okay, there could be a pest issue, whether it's an insect or a disease, but there's actually not a control product readily available to you. And so that's one of the difficulties sometimes with oddball fruits or other plants, where if we have a pest, there may not be a lot of options to control it. So in general, we want to use the practices of just making sure that our plants are being grown well, they are being cared for as much as possible, so we have happy, healthy plants that are better able to resist pest problems. What is available to us more generally on these type of crops are things like insecticidal soaps, horticultural oils, and of course, our good sanitation and cultural practice to limit the pests and diseases. And just beware, I will say figs, actually, because there is some commercial production in the US, there are some products that are labeled for pest control with figs. So there are some resources out there in pesticides, but not necessarily the others. So just be aware of that. So let's get started tonight talking first about figs. Figs are the one of the three that is not native to our area. And so Ficus carica is actually the cultivated species. There are other figs. Some we think of as fruit bearing, some are not. But the one we're going to be talking about tonight is Ficus carica. So if you've ever had a ficus tree in the house as a house plant, and then you moved it and all the leaves fell off, that is actually a cousin to these plants. These plants are thought to be native basically to Asiatic Turkey and then eastward into northern India. But part of the issue is these have been an ancient crop. And so they're very well established all around the Mediterranean. They are written about by Pliny the Elder and any number of other ancient medicinal folks. This is something that pretty much as long as we've had folks around, they've been eating figs. So very long history of this fruit and cultivation. Neat thing about it is it's a very unique fruit in physical growth. So it is actually a synconium that we eat. The thing about what we're eating when we eat a fruit, and you see it depicted there in the upper corner, is actually a collection of multiple tiny fruits inside a hollow receptacle. So what we think of as a fig hanging on a tree or a fig that we eat, that's the synconium. The fruit itself are the individual little things inside. They sort of have the crunchy to them. That's the seed. And so it is a unique fruit. I do not know of any other plant that utilizes the synconium as its fruit. So it is to figs alone. A lot of people know about wasp and figs. And so it is a unique fruit. It has its flowers on the inside of that synconium because that's where the fruit end up. So pollination happens through a small opening in that receptacle. A wasp will actually fly in there and it will pollinate. But the figs that we grow are commonly referred to as either persistent or common figs. Those are the varieties we grow in our region. Those are varieties that actually produce fruit without pollination. To produce fruit without pollination, the technical term for that is parthenocarpy, or we say they're parthenocarpic. So that means we have no wasp in our figs. And technically, even those varieties that are grown elsewhere that are pollinated by that little tiny wasp, there are actually enzymes in the green fruit that kind of dissolve the wasps. I don't know that by the time we actually harvest them to eat that you'd actually ever find a wasp inside your fig fruit, even if we had those wasps present in our environment, which we do not. So the good news is if you ever thought, well, I'd like to grow figs, but I don't want to eat a wasp in the fruit, don't worry about it. Those wasps aren't present in our environment. And the figs that we actually grow, those varieties don't even need the wasp involved in pollination. So we can have different varieties of figs that work well in our area. Green and yellow is kind of one broad category, and then dark. And the dark kind of ranges in hue. Sometimes you'll see them and see pictures of those that are purplish. Some are more brown. On the right, there's a picture of actual Celeste figs, which is one variety we could grow in our area. And that actually falls in the darker category, believe it or not. Those don't appear very dark on the screen, but that kind of brownish color to them does lend them to the darker category. We can't necessarily grow all varieties. And so one thing you find about figs in our region, they're shrubs. And so sometimes the question is, well, is it a tree or a shrub? For us, it's going to be a shrub. And the reason is tree forms are inevitably damaged by a harsh winter. They'll actually die back to the roots. This happens when we have weather that gets down to anywhere, depending on the variety, from 5 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit, which, you know, almost every season we're going to see some single digit temperatures in winter. Occasionally we may not, but it's not uncommon at all to have a fig shrub get killed back. Doesn't mean it happens every single year, and there are some things we can do to limit that, but it's not a problem because generally they will regrow an established bush from the roots, and that new growth happens the next spring. And so what we want to do is select those varieties that are most hardy, can tolerate the most severe winter temperatures, and yet still regrow. Here is what the forms we basically see. So very bush-like in appearance, multi-stemmed, not anything that kind of looks like a tree with a central leader. We have a brown turkey and a celeste. And again, both of them good options, and we'll talk about some of the possibilities on options. But they can be large shrubs, and so we'll talk about that somewhat. As a rule, don't choose Californian or mission fig varieties. And then LSU, which has had a significant amount of breeding work over the years with figs, their varieties are not suited to our environment. I don't think many of us look to Louisiana for varieties of any other plants, and figs would be no difference. So some of the suggested varieties you see there on your screen. Again, some of these like Chicago Hardy and others kind of point to their ability to tolerate cold winter weather. I have at the end locally sourced. So figs are not difficult to reproduce. So this is a plant that oftentimes gets shared among gardeners. So you can oftentimes find, someone that has a fig that has some sort of local heritage. Now, what's the chance it's a Chicago Hardy or brown turkey or one of these other varieties? Probably pretty good, honestly. But if there's a variety that is locally sourced, that is growing well for folks, don't overthink it. That could be a good option for you to grow. What we want in a planting site for figs is full sun. And by full sun, we mean 6 hours or more. Southern exposure is not a bad thing. That heats up earlier in the spring. We want to think about the microclimate of our environment. And what I mean by that is that we want to think about heat sinks. So heat sinks are those things that basically collect the heat solar energy and then release it at night. So hardscaping. So whether it is walls or even walkways that are composed of stone or brick or concrete, buildings, all of those can be a source of heat energy that is slowly released overnight. And it creates these little microclimates that can stay warmer than the surrounding areas. So this is, on a bigger scale than just a microclimate on your property. This is, the heat island effect that we see with cities. And so we can actually take advantage of that sometimes and get some protection for plants like figs that have some marginal hardiness to it. We do want to consider, though, how far away we're planting these plants from things such as walls. These can become large shrubs, particularly when we have a few mild winters in a row. And so we don't want to plant them too close to buildings. 3 to 4 feet away at least would be a very good rule of thumb. When it comes to pH, nothing unusual for the garden. They like slightly acidic soil, so 6 to 6.5, which is basically a good range to be for most garden, vegetable, or ornamental species that we grow. We do want to see it be well drained. So not uncommon, again, if plants aren't specifically adapted to saturated soils, we basically want to see well drained, because if we have soils that stay too wet, we can have root death, and obviously that's not great for plants. If we're sourcing plants, container grown plants can basically be planted any time of the year. We want to be aware of root bound plants if they've been grown in container. So that may mean cutting that root ball or otherwise teasing out those roots so they don't keep growing in a circle as they often do when they're crowded in that container. Bare root plants are also available. And so generally we plant those while they are still dormant in late spring. Probably getting towards the end of that period now, but there might still be a source for dormant plants. Figs are not deeply rooted, so be aware of that. Sometimes we tend to forget that lots of plants will have those root systems extend beyond the canopy. So don't think of the root system ending at the canopy. If you're planting them in a bed and you're wanting to do other things in that bed, think about what you're doing with soil disturbance, because they are shallow rooted and they are wide spreading. So while planting something else in there with hand tools is probably okay, we don't necessarily want to be tilling up large swaths of a bed around a fig tree or shrub rather. Oftentimes, fertilization is not critical, but what we can do is we can actually look at the shoot growth from the prior year to tell us if we need to be fertilizing. And so if we're having less than 18 inches of new growth each year, we're probably in a situation where there's low fertility. That can be a little complicated, of course, if it's a very dry year and we're not irrigating or things like that. So we kind of want to put the lens of experience and climate that's happening. But generally, when there's not a lot of growth, it's a good idea to look at fertilizing plants. We generally don't want to fertilize plants immediately when they're planted. We like for them to become established and then look at doing fertility. we can look at utilizing a soil test. If we haven't soil tested our garden for a number of years, it makes a good plan to do that. Uh, and when we are fertilizing, we don't want to fertilize after late summer. Because what happens, one response to nitrogen fertilization, for instance, is for a plant to put on new growth. And if we do that late in the summer, we can actually force a plant to grow, and then that new growth doesn't have time to harden off before winter, and it gets winter killed, particularly in a plant like this that we know already may have some marginal winter hardiness issues. So make sure we're not fertilizing late in the season. We do generally prune these into a bush form. That first growing season when we plant, we really don't have to do any pruning. I'm of the mind that, a lot of people will say, well, if we're planting a bare root plant, we want to trim the top back in balance to the root ball. I get the science behind it and the reasoning. I'm not a big fan of that. And the reason I'm not a huge fan of that is one of the responses to cutting back plants is more growth. It goes back to plant hormones, the flow of auxin, subordinated buds. And so if we are drastically pruning a plant, we are going to have more growth happen. So my personal preference is, rather than prune those plants at planting, we just plant them as is and allow the plant to self-prune. Because a plant will balance itself. It will have parts die back if we have too little root system under too large of a plant. And so I don't know that we actually make a better situation whenever we go in there, start pruning heavily, and then we get a lot of new growth automatically from that pruning. What we like to do in that first dormant season pruning after we planted is select 4 to 8 vigorous, well-placed shoots, sort of as the main leaders of the bush. We're going to remove others that we don't select. So we will be thinning some things out. We also want to head the entire plant back 1/3 to 1/2 to control the size, because these can get large. What's good is these do fruit on new growth. That's why we're able to be this aggressive in a dormant pruning and remove that much of the plant. If these bloomed on prior seasons of growth, we wouldn't be able to do this, but we can control their size with dormant pruning because it's the new season's growth that actually fruits for us. And as always, if you've heard some of my other pruning talks, we always want to look for the 3 Ds within a plant. And that's looking for dead, diseased, or damaged stems. So if we have stems that are crossing one another, rubbing, or otherwise problematic, they're growing into a walkway, something like that, dormant season is a perfect time to be removing those. In future years after that, so that second dormant season pruning and beyond, big thing we're doing is heading back the entire plant. If we've had dieback, we may be reestablishing those main leaders again. So that process is something that we do have happen from time to time, where we do have dieback to the roots. And again, 3 Ds as always, and anything that's problematic for us. So not a tremendous amount of pruning other than maintaining its size in the space we have for it. What about containers? So figs can actually be grown in a container. We probably want about a 20-gallon volume for mature plants. We wouldn't necessarily start out in a 20-gallon volume as our container to begin with, but we would be potting it up as it grows and ultimately end up in something that large. What's important to understand about containers is that plants that we put in a container are more susceptible to winter injury than if they were growing in the ground. And so this is a scenario where we have a plant that's already marginally hardy in the ground. We definitely want to make sure we have the ability to take that container and somehow place it in a protected area. Certainly, as we're getting into the teens in temperatures, we would be afraid we could start seeing damage on those roots, because roots in a container are more exposed to temperature changes. And so we do want to think about, do we have somewhere like an unheated basement or an unheated garage where it could go into for the coldest portion of winter? Do we have a microclimate that may allow it to survive the lowest temperatures? Containerized plants are going to require management on our part to make sure they do survive winter. What's good is container plants typically don't grow as fast as if we were growing them in the ground. So there's going to actually be less pruning associated with container plants. So we may not be removing a third of that plant every season to control growth because it's simply not growing as much. So this is one where we won't necessarily see 18 inches of growth. We do probably want to look at root pruning and repotting every 3 to 4 years. And so that would just help rejuvenate the plant. And again, over time, we start smaller, then work up to that larger volume. So figs are fairly tolerant of dry conditions, but that's not to say they don't benefit from irrigation. Because certainly during dry periods, they will. Containers are going to be more sensitive to dry periods than we would see with growing in the ground. And so we do want to make sure we're doing a good job on those containers. We're not allowing them to become too dry. What we do see, if you are watering figs, you want to make sure your watering is consistent, because if you're inconsistent, you can have fruit splitting as a problem. So you do want to try to be as consistent with that as possible. It's always never a good idea to tell you how much to water, but again, with most watering, it's better to water less frequently, but more deeply. And so rather than watering every day, watering twice a week for a longer period of time and charging that soil is a better way to go about irrigation. We do want to consider reducing the water we're applying as they start to transition into dormancy in the fall. One, they're using less water because they're not as actively growing, and two, our temperatures are lower, so the demand is lessened. So what about elderberries? So shifting gears, now we have a native plant we'll talk about. And so if you're not familiar with elderberries, this may come as a surprise. Elderberries are not typically advised to be eaten raw. Generally, there's the consideration that all varieties of elderberries should be cooked or processed in some manner before consuming, typically basically having heat applied in some manner. This is because there are chemicals within elderberry plants that basically ultimately become cyanide. And so we can actually have cyanide poisoning essentially from elderberries if the right circumstances are present. What's interesting is there's been some recent research that may bring this into question, but I'm really not seeing this cautionary statement be removed anywhere. So University of Missouri is doing a tremendous amount of work related to elderberries. They're looking at breeding better varieties, looking at how to bring it into commercial production, because there's actually a pretty decent market for elderberries. But anyway, this is the research paper. You can see the citation there at the bottom. In their findings, I pulled out just one statement, and they just say that the total cyanogenic potential and cyanogenic glycosides levels in the tissues of American elderberry pose no threat to consumers. It is advisable to separate out the stems, green berries, and leaves from American elderberries, ripe berries during the product preparation. And so, yes, there you can actually, like in unheated juices and various things like that, you can find some levels of these glycosides, but they're at such a low level, they're actually not dangerous to humans. And in fact, apple seeds, for instance, there's at least one chemical that's common between the two that, technically speaking, apple seeds have some of these glycosides in them, it don't really pose an issue to people, again, because the levels are so low. But I'll just say everybody has to make their own decision. Honestly, raw elderberries are typically very astringent. They're not something that most people would probably want to eat raw off the plant anyway. But just be aware that while in theory, American elderberry, and I will say there are other varieties of elderberry, we're just talking about one tonight. The levels that are present in them typically shouldn't be a problem for most folks. So if you've ever stumbled across this and thought, am I taking my life into my own hands if I grow or prepare products from elderberries? I don't think that you are. If you're not too familiar with elderberries, they're again a bush. You couldn't call them a tree. They are native. And if you've never seen the flowers, very pretty flowers, and they actually get pollinated by a lot of, they get visited, let me say that, they get visited by a lot of insects. So American elderberries are thought of as being a subspecies of Sambucus nigra. You'll also see them just referred to as Sambucus canadensis. I don't know which taxonomist is going to win out in the end. So you actually see both in reference materials if you go looking. It is native, which is interesting. Again, not for fresh eating. There actually is one of the resources that is basically giving you a bunch of recipes and practices that you can implement when utilizing the berries that would remove any concerns for you. You can also harvest the harvest the flowers. And so the flowers can actually be turned into like a syrup. So I know I have seen and actually have had a canned lemonade product that was like elderflower lemonade. It's pretty good, had a good flavor. But there's other uses for the flowers as well. What we see mostly with elderberries is, yes, you can make wine, juice, or jellies. But the biggest driver in the industry is actually nutritional supplementation or nutraceutical. So the color of elderberries is related to their anthocyanin content. Anthocyanin is one of those phytochemicals in plants, which is thought to be very health promoting. So that's kind of driving the market. Although with recent happenings with certain colors being removed from foods, I also wonder now as a natural color and if elderberries may have a moment in the sun as well. Because again, that high anthocyanin content does lend them to be a colorant as well. The flowers are highly attractive to native insects. And notice I didn't say honeybees necessarily. So if you've ever grown these, I know my parents' farm, they have some wild growing elderberries. When they're in bloom, if you go look at the blossoms, you will see all sorts of little insects all over it, not just bee shapes, but others as well. If you look at the flowers, I think part of it is the pollen is well exposed. And so pollen is a protein source for a lot of insects. So I think that's part of it. What's interesting is it's not really clear exactly who is best responsible for pollinating elderberries. So there's actually a bit of a question as to, in the native environment, who is the primary pollinator. It's not really answered. So you do see a lot of insects visiting it. So if you want to bring more insect diversity to your garden, I think elderberries would be a great one to grow because they do that well. Elderberry varieties can be self-pollinating, but generally speaking, it's thought that mixed cultivars will improve fruit set. And so do keep that in mind, that having more than one cultivar is probably going to enhance that berry set. Name varieties are going to typically have better quality than wild sourced. A lot of these named varieties were selected from wild plants. They were seen to be especially heavy bearing or large berry size or things like that. So I'm not going to totally discount local specimens because, again, this is a plant that's actually pretty easy to propagate. So certainly if you know some people that have some and they're doing great and it was collected locally, could still be a very valid option for us. But as a rule, some of these suggestive varieties are going to actually bring us a bigger harvest. What's unfortunate is because this is such a minor crop, even though there is some commercialization information out there, we don't really have variety trials in Tennessee on any of these. Again, most of the work is coming out of Missouri. They're working with locations throughout the Midwest on doing some variety trials to see how they perform. But Missouri is not too dissimilar to Tennessee. I mean, they certainly have hot, humid summers. So I think varieties that do perform well in Missouri would likely be positive candidates for us to try as well. Some of these other varieties on there too that didn't come out of Tennessee, so like Bob Gordon and Wildwood, if I remember correctly, are two that did. I think Adams and York actually came out of up north. Because there is a limitation somewhat on these going northward on winter survival. So those are varieties that are noted for winter survival in other environments than ours. They are an adaptable plant. So they have a pH range on the acid side ranging from 5.5 to 6.5. So fairly broad and fairly acid. Below 5.5, you're getting into the realm of blueberries solidly. So, not very picky if it has that wide of a range. Again, full sun is kind of preferred, but you will find these growing in some shade. Just understand that the more shade there is, the less production you're going to have. They do like moisture, so you can find them in moist places, but it has to be well-drained soil, so not in a waterlogged area. So again, these are not a bog-adapted plant. We don't want to stick them where their roots are going to stay wet all the time. As a shrub, they can still get very large. And so their final size when unpruned can easily be 10 feet by 12 feet tall, which means they can be great if you've got a large area you're trying to fill. They do spread by suckers, so they can spread from where we plant them. They're not invasive like bamboo or something like that, but just be aware that it's not just going to stay put exactly where you place it. They are available in the trade as bare root plants, container grown, and cuttings. I would probably not suggest that you try to container grow a elderberry, just given the size of the plant. But certainly, if you have an area in a garden, they can do well for us. Now, there actually is a range of pruning options available to us with elderberries. And in part, we know this because of commercialization research. So, in their native environment, they're basically unpruned. But we know that if we do some pruning, we're going to have higher yields and higher quality from the berries. And even if we're looking for the biggest berry, we would even be talking about removing some of the blossoms. So I mentioned that like you can use the blossoms as a harvest as well. One of the reasons we harvest those inflorescences is it can increase the berry size. So there's actually a double duty there. Yes, we get that inflorescence as a crop, but it also will help us have larger berries. What we find that some commercial growers will actually do is each year, once it gets basically dormant, they will actually prune it back to 6 inches tall. What they're trying to do is limit the size of that plant when they go to harvest. Because once again, elderberries fruit on new wood. So it doesn't matter that you removed all last year's growth, because that's not where we find the fruit. It's going to be on new wood, on new growth that we actually have fruiting. So this is one that while it can grow large, we can definitely control the size with severe pruning and dormancy. And it's not going to harm the plant. So this is one to keep in mind. If we don't want it to grow larger or fill a big space, we have that option to be really severe with pruning without negatively affecting the yields. And so probably for a lot of garden areas, kind of a moderated approach where we go through and remove the 3Ds again, the dead disease, the damaged, and then we can actually go in and selectively remove the oldest growth that we have there. That will help limit the size too. So instead of having something that's grown in height and width 3 years, we can kind of keep that to 1 or 2 years in size. Again, there's nothing wrong with the severe cutting back each dormant pruning to maintain size, but certainly just removing selective portions that are oldest and largest is also another way to do that and limit the size. So again, a lot of options. You almost can't incorrectly prune an elderberry. Worst case scenario, if you don't prune, you might see less production. There are maybe a couple of pests worth note on elderberries. One of those is Japanese beetles can find it highly attractive. Um, the spotted-winged Drosophila, which is a little fruit fly, that's another potential pest that can attack the berry. What's challenging about the spotted-winged Drosophila is that most fruit flies need damaged or overripe fruit before they can actually lay eggs and actually successfully invade that fruit. The spotted-winged Drosophila can actually attack healthy fruit because it essentially on the ovipositor, the little organ that the female has to lay eggs, actually has kind of like saw teeth on there. So it'll actually cut into healthy fruit. And so it's more of a nuisance. Again, those may or may not be a high pressure pest in our area or in your yard, but something to be aware of. The other thing to be aware of is birds like elderberries. So I ran across one statement. They said like 1,200 different species of birds would feed on elderberries. Now, given that, I'm sure that's around the world because there are European species, for instance, of elderberries. But certainly we have any number of birds in our region that would find the berries attractive. So, again, depending how important that harvest is, you may end up needing to net those plants. In those scenarios, I think certainly that dormant pruning severely to 6 inches tall probably would be most applicable, simply so it's easier to net that plant in that growing season. So if birds become a problem in your area, you may look at utilizing that pruning strategy to enable you to net them more efficiently. What about pawpaws? So pawpaw is our third and last fruit tonight. It is a native fruit. You can see the range there, pretty much most of the eastern U.S. and even up into Canada. Very interesting fruit. It is the largest native fruit that we can grow. So it is a large fruit. Oftentimes what we find in the wild, they are not that large, but improved varieties, and especially under cultivation and care, we can get very large fruit on them. They are basically a member of the custard apple family, which is a tropical fruit. Their Latin name, Asimina triloba. The triloba actually refers to the flowers, which we'll look at here in a moment. But again, very unusual in that it is a tropical family. In our areas where we find them is naturally along creeks and rivers, kind of in bottoms, but don't let that lead you to believe that they want wet feed. Again, these are not marshy or bog trees. They don't want to be in wet areas. They need well-drained areas. A neat thing about it is our state butterfly, the zebra swallowtail. These are actually a host plant. So I guess technically those caterpillars would be a pest, but it's a butterfly, so I think we can tolerate it. So what I said about growing in bottom areas, does this look like the native habitat of pawpaws? No. And in fact, this is actually an orchard that's at Kentucky State University. They do a lot of research and have for a number of years with pawpaws. And this is basically their approach to doing a commercial orchard. And so very unlike if you've ever been in creek bottoms across our region, you're not going to see nice full sun conditions like this. And I'll also wager if you've ever seen pawpaws in the wild, they didn't really look like this. They didn't have that pyramidal form. They probably were not this heavily limbed. And so it's actually, I bring this up because it's really an adaptable plant when you think about what it likes to inhabit as its native conditions. We can find, well, There are sometimes bare root plants on the market. In all honesty, you're probably better off to look at container grown. Um, these will grow with a taproot. And so we often find the container grown plants in tall plants, sometimes referred to as like tree pots. And it's purposely because they do have that longer taproot, and we want to keep that intact. If we break it, they're not going to survive and do well. There are a number of named varieties. The KSU prefaced ones are actually coming out of the breeding program at Kentucky State University, but there are others that have been collected around the eastern U.S. And so those are some. There are others. If you look at a lot of nurseries, sometimes there's a very extensive list of varieties, but all of these should do well in our region. And all of these are going to give you larger than wild fruit size, for instance. And so looking at name varieties is definitely a positive action. One thing to be aware of, young plants do benefit from shade in the first year and maybe even the second year. So again, think back to really, this is an understory tree in its native environment. And so I actually pulled these images from a Cornell publication, and it's on the resource list. But they're taking a tomato cage and they're utilizing that to provide shade with some actually cloth materials. Obviously, you can buy shade cloth. Even window screening material provides a good bit of shade in and of itself. And so certainly as the plant gets larger, you may only be shading it, for instance, in the right-hand picture from the western sun. So you may only be shading it on one side rather than completely surrounding it. But just keep in mind, natively, these are plants that are growing in the understory. They are shaded as young plants. And if we stick them out in full sun as very young trees, we're probably not going to have a good survival rate. So shade is appreciated in those early years. Soil pH, again, this probably has one of the widest ranges you will see in plants. 5.5, which again is knocking on the door for blueberries, all the way up to 7, which is alkaline. So pH is not an issue for this plant, basically. If you have plants growing in your garden, your pH is going to be acceptable to it. It does need to be well drained. Again, even though these grow in those bottom lands often associated with streams and rivers, they do need to be in well-drained soil, so not wet conditions. They do appreciate fertility. Irrigation, especially while they're establishing and young, is important. Once they're more mature, it's less important, but that's not unusual with plants. Typically, when you go to buy these, what you'll find is name varieties are actually grafted. And again, those name varieties are going to be a preference for fruit size, as well as even characteristics like as number of seed and fruit. And I'll explain that in a moment. The other thing to understand when we go to plant pawpaws is varieties themselves are really not self-fertile. And the reason is it's because if I remember correctly, when the flowers are first opening, the female parts are receptive to pollen, but the male parts are not yet shedding pollen. So you need another tree that has an overlap of bloom that actually has male flower parts that are shedding pollen. And so it's because of this timing difference between female and male parts on an individual tree that you won't necessarily get self-pollination. I think technically it's possible, but it's not reliable. What happens sometimes is people will have pawpaws, growing on their property or something, and they'll tell you that, well, they never fruit. There's never anything on there. What could be happening is pawpaws will sucker from the roots and form thickets. And so while you may see multiple trees, that may be genetically one single tree. And so that can cause an issue with pollen shedding and timing if there aren't other pawpaws around in the area. So looking at having a second distinct variety of pawpaws should allow for more successful pollination. Pollination is primarily thought to be from either flies or beetles, specifically like carrion type beetles. because these flowers with the 3-petal arrangement that you see there in that picture are not um, scented fragrantly in a positive way. It's kind of supposed to smell like carrion or rotting meat. And so they're not attracting something that would be after sweet smelling flowers, for instance. But I've never seen reference or nor experienced it myself that these are in any way off-putting to having in your garden. So it's not that malodorous. We the flower as it's displayed here, you could see it like that if you're looking straight up. Typically, those flowers are actually hanging down on the underside of a branch. So if you're looking up, you could actually see that arrangement, but they kind of have a bell-shaped flower when viewed from the side. But again, that 3-petal arrangement. So I mentioned name varieties typically have fewer seeds, not just larger fruit. So here are a couple of pictures. One, the seeds on the right, and on the left, the number of seeds that are in a fruit. And so one of the key characteristics when they're looking at improving varieties of pawpaws, they're looking at reducing the number of seeds. Because essentially when we harvest a pawpaw, you utilize the pulp of the fruit for whatever you're wanting to make. And it's almost like extracting a puree from the fruit just to separate it from all the seeds that are in there. So pawpaw fruits are not something where you're going to take it and quickly, easily slice it and serve it. That's not what you get out of a pawpaw fruit. It's more of a puree that you create and you remove the seeds from the fruit. So that's one key characteristic that they do look to improve with named varieties. When it comes to pruning, pawpaws really aren't pruned much at all. And as we're planting these trees in the full sun, you will see they have more limbs to them and more of a pyramid shape than we would see in their native environment. Shaded trees, fewer limbs, especially lower on the tree, and it's just they're not getting enough sunlight to support multiple limbs down there. So really, other than the 3Ds, the dead, diseased, or damaged limbs, we don't really prune these much at all. We kind of just let them grow as they will. If something happens, if there's a problem, certainly we can do corrective actions, but this is not a tree that we're going to be pruning much in our orchard. Fruit on these is late in the year, so that's one welcome addition, I think, to when you contrast that with small berries or things that are typically more summertime. This does give us a later fruiting period. The fruit itself has a short shelf life. This is one reason it's never been adapted to commercial production well. It just simply doesn't have a shelf life to move it to market. On the fruit, as they're growing on the tree, they're green. They will change color and start getting yellowish, and they can't even get dark splotches, very reminiscent of overripe bananas. But they can be completely ripe when green. So the color is not necessarily a good indicator of when do I pick the fruit. The strong aroma coming from the fruit is a good indicator it's ripe. Those that are ripe will have a lovely smell to them. The ripe fruit itself has some give to it when it's ripe. So even if it's green, if you're squeezing that fruit and there's a little bit of give, think kind of like an avocado, then you probably have a ripe fruit, especially if you have that strong aroma. And so if you grow pawpaws, I encourage you, start filling those fruit as we start getting into August. You'll see the size on them. They'll be green, but they'll be hard. As they start softening, you'll get the aroma and you'll also get that softening feel. And that's what you know it's ripe. Probably, in my opinion, in my experience, if you wait until that fruit has dark blotches like a banana, it's actually overripe. And typically you see those laying on the ground and they've actually fallen off the tree. So in my opinion, when you see dark blotches, you're pretty much past the ideal stage of harvest. Not to say it's not edible, but it's just not the ideal stage of harvest. So I know there's probably a lot of unanswered questions, so I want to point you to the resources I've added at the resource document. If you've seen this link before, you are correct. We've used it before, but I've updated the document. So at the very end of it, on the last page, we have these uncommon fruits and resources for it. Some of the primary resources are produced by University of Tennessee. I want to encourage you to look at the links that are contained in that document of the resources that were used to create it, because those are some great quality materials too. So don't just think of it as the end stop. Look at those other resources as jumping off points. And so I think you'll find it useful. And as always, feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to answer questions. But with that, we are done with the presentation, and we will pause for questions.